Thanks for watching live or listening back to this show from Teachers Talk Radio. You can catch up with all our shows by visiting our YouTube channel or by listening back at ttradio.org. Don't forget to like and subscribe to enjoy more live education conversation from TTR. We hope you enjoy this show.
Outstanding and world-class vision and world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to Points of View. We are all on our summer holiday. And just a reminder that this show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. And you can level up your professional development today. So our first article today, a really nice topic, actually. It's an article titled "On the Importance of Teacher Voices." And essentially, the article talks about how there's a growing industry of people linked to teaching in some way, often because they are ex-teachers, which in of itself is considered controversial to say, but, a growing number of people who work with schools and do a lot of work in and around or related to schools, but not necessarily in the classroom anymore. And, the article talks somewhat about how there's been a rise in, consultants, speakers, all related to schools and education, and how sometimes the thing that teachers essentially find the most helpful is to actually do the hard yards in the classroom. And so that's essentially what we're going to be talking about as our first topic. So does anyone want to start with their view?
Well, I can, because I don't work in education anymore, but I'm not. I don't go into schools anymore, and I don't tell them, I don't advise or anything like that. But I'm a counsellor. I work at the other end, so we have children and families, scrutiny meetings. Obviously, councils aren't responsible for any of the academies, but the local authority schools are, and so I represent a voice from teaching as best as I can on those committees. And I understand where she's coming from, that when you are out of it, things can change really quickly. Now, one of the arguments I saw somebody pushing back on was the fact that they are still very much embedded in schools. The argument was almost a to and fro. You have to know those children. You have to be in that same classroom. They have to be your students. And the argument back was, look, we are in schools and we know what students are like. And we know when you look from the outside, it is easier to see what can be done, I suppose, to improve things or to make things easier. My concern is about how much money schools spend on all of these things. I remember when I worked in the maths department, and nearly every team meeting there was a new thing. There's a new thing, and we can subscribe. What do people think? And and actually we had so many website addresses, so many places to go to get your resources and things. In the end, so many people coming in and telling us how things could be done better or differently, or the new ideas in practice. I think it ends up causing a lot of confusion, to be honest, and I think we could almost do with simplifying the system. So I get where she's coming from. If she's got recruitment issues, she's got people that they're paying to come and talk to them about the changes that they could implement, and she's thinking, well, the change we could implement is if you came and taught in the school and we wouldn't have those vacancies, and then maybe we could do everything a bit better. That's what I think.
I do agree with that. I think what she's saying fundamentally isn't even limited to education. I think any employee for any employer in any industry is their back's gonna go up when someone from outside, someone from head office, someone from regional shows up and has opinions. And it's like, you don't work in the store, you don't know these customers, you don't know the staff, you don't know what it's like day to day in this specific place, in this particular context. I remember working at a very large, well-known international coffee chain in when I was in university. And we loved our store, and it was crazy, and it was at a very lively place in the middle of downtown Toronto. And we would get so angry when head office would show up unannounced with these grand decrees. And it's like, you have no idea what it's like to be in this place. This isn't just your corporate world. This is so much more than that. So it's that feeling of, you don't work here, you don't know us. That is a totally normal, natural reaction, I think, in any workplace, anywhere. And then when you add in the fact that teaching is so person-centered and you've got thousands of individual human beings involved in this, it becomes very personal very quickly. And we were talking before as well about how teachers have this tendency to make teaching their entire identity. Once you're a teacher, you tend to identify with that so deeply. And the idea that someone who's not a teacher could be telling you, the teacher, how to teach is kind of offensive. And the flip side of that is people who were teachers and then aren't teachers now still identify as being teachers, even though they're not teaching. There's so many layers that I think are completely normal, natural things. And I completely understand where she's coming from. More so than I understand the massive pushback that's come back against that article, I think.
I also think there is a difference between, and it depends, doesn't it, the situation that you're in? Because again, I'm not a full-time class teacher anymore. However, I do think, within the role that I've played, where I am at the moment, some of it was curriculum development, some of it was for example, the way that we teach vocabulary, that kind of thing, I had some input into that and kind of, how we should go about doing that, across the board. This was within the primaries. But having said that, the year after, I was actually sort of co-teaching a class. So I was actually having to implement my own ideas. And I do think that made a massive difference. So now I still feel like I can give talks about certain things or CPD on certain things. But actually, I do think that process of having had to do it myself did matter. Do you know what I mean? It did, because how could you stand up in front of any teacher and go, well, this is the way that you should do it, if you don't even know how to do it yourself, or you've never done it yourself, and you can't model it, you can't see the pros and cons of that approach, you can't. Do you see what I mean? Talk. What I give now is based on well, actually I did this, but actually hang on, it wasn't that straightforward. Actually, we have to have flexibility because the types of words that you teach, sometimes you have to teach it like this, but all of that makes sense because I'd come from a teaching background straight away, but then I'd had to go back and actually implement some of these things. And I do think it's important in these roles and I do think there is a sense in which that you do need people who are out of the classroom who still have some of these roles. Because let's be honest, if you're a full-time class teacher, there's no way that you could do some of the roles that I was doing. I don't see how you could be a lead across an English lead across 5 schools, which is what I did in one place. I don't see how you could impact in certain ways because you just wouldn't have the time. Do you see what I mean? You just wouldn't have time to be able to do that and be a full-time class teacher or be a full-time head teacher. So I think there needs to be some appreciation that sometimes we need people to do some of these jobs, particularly if we're talking about workload and things like that. So yes, in a lot of multi-academy trusts, you will have teams that are designing the curriculum, etc. However, I think there's a bit more flexibility within that to say, actually, you can go in and actually teach some of your ideas, teach some of your lessons. Do you see what I mean? Go back in, check on what's going on, see what's actually happening, see what's realistic and what's not realistic, and actually get stuck in and be involved. And I think that's important, by the way, that you have that back and forth, because I don't think you should be telling people to do things and then just take a step back and expect them to do it. If you're telling people to do retrieval practice, that's all very well. It's all very well writing a nice book about it, but actually, is what you're saying actually realistic? And I think part of the problem is when people not just step away from the classroom, but step away from the sector itself, in the sense that the schools themselves, it's really easy, really quickly to develop very unrealistic ideas. And I think those of us who step out of the classroom need to be really aware that, yes, maybe your job is still important and maybe there is a value to it and a reason to it. And actually, we need to have that conversation both ways and be honest about it. Sometimes people, and again, sometimes it's hard unless you've got an, you know, sympathetic employer, or a situation where, you know, you've got that time to be able to write things or whatever. It may not be realistic, but I think we have to be very conscious that you have stepped away and actually you don't have the day-to-day anymore, and you need to go back in and have that dialogue. And to that extent, I'm really sympathetic to what was being written, because I think it's really easy to come out with all sorts of like lovely ideas that are simply not practical. And my entire sort of, you know, beginning of my career was filled full of like lovely ideas, completely impractical in the classroom. But the person who was spouting them could always go down to, well, it's, you know, blame the teacher. Well, if it didn't happen, it's teacher implementation. And actually, I think it's right that teachers and head teachers should push back against that, because actually it's not always implementation. Sometimes it's your idea. Do you know what I mean? Like, actually, and where is the dialogue there? Because actually it's really hard, because I think it's really hard for schools when an idea has failed or a consultant hasn't done a good job. Actually, we never find out about these things. Do you see what I mean? And it's a really difficult situation, because, you know, again, I can see there are, again, you know, sort of on the grapevine underneath, you know, sort of like informally, you know, there are various consultants who I know have got a bad reputation, yet they still sell their wares. And, you know, the fact of the matter is, it's really unfortunate, because all it is anecdote. Those anecdotes build up. Do you know what I mean? But the problem is we've got a vast system, and quite frankly, you can sell snake oil all over the place and get away with it.
One of the things that I do, like, I think on the one hand, like, part of me thinks, you know, teaching has so many transferable skills. You know, I know so many different industries love to hire former teachers, because, you know, I'd say teachers are probably good at everything. You know, like, you get an amazing skill set from teaching. And also, I think a lot of the people that are drawn to teaching often have those skills quite intrinsically. And, you know, being a teacher develops so many of your skills. And I think on the one hand, part of me feels like, yes, it can sometimes be nice that schools are able to access the support and expertise of, I don't know, different people. They might have a particular need, and there might be somebody who historically has really succeeded in that in another context. However, on the other hand, I just think one of the things that really stood out to me in the article, if I just get it out, it said, you know, it says, understanding the heartbeat of the school, tracing its fingerprint, feeling its pulse. We love that. But you're not, even if you're in a cross-mat role, you're here, but in reality, you're not quite. I know it's nicer to feel that you are, but the accountability is different. You're not part of the body of a school, not truly under its skin. And I feel like that really stood out to me, because, I mean, every school I've been to is completely different. Not long ago, I came out of a PRU as a senior leader, and I was really excited to go to a mainstream setting that was, you know, rated required improvement by Ofsted. Everyone knows I don't really care about Ofsted ratings, but, you know, I was like, just, you know, really raring to go, because I just thought, you know what, I've worked in a PRU, I succeeded there, I'll be able to bring, you know, a skill set to many pupils who had very similar needs and backgrounds and very similar kind of context. But it was so hard and so difficult. And I think the quiet part in teaching that often isn't talked about is how teachers are just constantly expected to take things on the chin. It's seen as part of your professional development to just take feedback after feedback, whether it's based in evidence, whether you agree or not. The professional thing to do is to just take it on the chin. Anything else is seen as defensive or, you know, unprofessional, or maybe, you know, you're not willing to develop, or you're not willing to listen to other people's point of view. You're often, unless you're working with amazing leaders or people with a lot of emotional intelligence, or people willing to, you know, get any kind of pushback or get any kind of counter opinions or arguments, sometimes you're just expected to take on every single person's feedback. And I think the quiet part for me is not just that, but also just because a set of policies or a certain protocol worked for you in a particular setting doesn't necessarily mean that you can transfer that to, yes, you can transfer your individual skills, but you can't necessarily transfer all of your successes and all of the things that you were able to implement elsewhere into these other schools. And that's kind of, it gets ignored a lot. Like I've never been a consultant, but I have before supported different schools with, I've done like projects on like behaviour management. And anytime I've gone to visit a school or I've been asked to work with a department, the first thing I've always said is, you're the expert in your department. And like, I really want to make clear, I'm not here to like challenge your teaching or challenge, do you know what I mean? Like, I'm not here to find faults. I don't necessarily, like, do you know what I mean? Like, I'm here to look for your strengths. And I've also got, I've been asked to do this. I've got some ideas. They've worked for me in this context, and I'm happy to share everything I have, whether that's resources, my ideas, things I've done, but it's totally up to you what you want to do. I'm not going to like come and do any kind of like follow up or come and observe you, because observations seems to be the litmus test for whether or not you're doing things right. And again, I've got, I take huge issue with that. But, I just feel like there's so much. Even the time I did the project, by the way, it was just because I was working with an organization that was developing teachers with good behavior management into like kind of different, it was just a project in the sense of trying to experience different kind of leadership roles. Like, it wasn't something I was like paid for, or like going into schools as like a consultant. I couldn't imagine ever calling myself a consultant or like walking into a school like that. But like, I always got on with those people I was working with, because I think it's really important to remember that teachers, like, it's kind of like an elephant in the room. Do you know what I mean? When you come to somebody else and they're the full-time timetable teacher or the middle leader running that department, responsible for everything, you're never going to be in the same position as them. And I feel like you need to mention that. You need to credit them.
Yeah.
It just doesn't happen enough.
That's such a sensible, respectful way of dealing with it.
One last thing I was going to say, another issue I have with these like million roles in schools is, one of the most important parts of working with others is collegiality and, gaining buy-in and building relationships and people being able to trust you. But I think what happens a lot of the time is people are in and out. And one of the risks to having stuff like that is, if somebody just trashes someone's lesson or really like causes them to spiral or puts them down, sometimes there's just no accountability. I can't remember if it was Lucy or Tajinda, but somebody just said, we never actually hear about the consultant projects that didn't actually work in a school. We don't know what didn't succeed. We never hear about it. And another issue I have as well is, people don't know. Someone can be so rude to a teacher in your school who's trying really hard and trying their best, and that can really impact the well-being and self-esteem and confidence and even commitment to teaching. Like, I wonder sometimes, does looking at all these other people in these shiny roles who aren't doing, like, for me, I'll speak for myself, but the hardest part of teaching for me has always been, the actual teaching. That's the hardest part. Having a full day of teaching, having duties, all the other stuff that you can preempt that happens in a day. Like, sometimes at the end of the day, I'm just completely slumped. And I'm sure that's something all teachers have in common at some point in their careers, if not every day. And I just feel like you don't want to be in a position where even more of your teachers are leaving because they have other people talking at them all the time, and they can see that they're not doing as much as they are.
And I think it's important, though, that in that situation, because I don't think that, because I think the problem here is, like, are we saying that, there should not be any consultant, there should be no spreading of expertise, because that doesn't work either. Do you see what I mean? Yeah. However, I do think that what you need to think about, like within these situations, is the systems that you've got in place. So when you're sort of, for example, if you're supporting a particular school, actually, how many people are going in? What's the actual, do you see what I mean? Like, it's all very well saying everybody should, you do learning walks, people come in, they support when they can. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing as well, because sometimes schools do need more support than other times, right? But I do think that then it falls on the leadership to go, right, this is the support that I've got, this is how I want to utilize it. And actually it should be in their hands, whether it's a consultant, whether it's somebody from the MAP, whether it's somebody from the local authority, or like, the RISE teams are coming in now as well and suggesting somebody. But actually, it should be long-term support if that's necessary. necessary. It should be sustainable. And I think these principles need to be put in place, not just quick fix solutions. And that's part of the problem, is that sometimes people want very quick fix solutions, and those quick fix solutions don't occur, because actually what you need to do sometimes is work with people over time, and actually, you know, be really mindful that, you know, you haven't got 5 different people coming in setting 5 different targets for like an ECT1. Do you know what I mean? Like, yeah, that's really easily done. I completely appreciate where you're coming from. And the other thing is actually how successful are teachers. You know, there was this phrase that, and I don't think Andrew Old invented it. I don't think Andrew Smith invented it. But he used to always say, you know, if this is the aspirin, what's the headache? Do you know what I mean? Like, you know, so literally there are so many times like you're being aspirins, and you don't have a headache. It's just, you know, it's just tick a box, or it's because, you know, particularly like when I first started teaching, there was a lot of sort of, you know, kind of, well, that school got their outstanding and Ofsted, right, we better just do what they're doing for writing, not because it suited that particular school or our particular environment, but just because, well, if we do that, then we'll get our tick, right? And I do think, to be fair, like, and I know that people have their issues with Ofsted, I do think they've improved on those kind of things. I don't think you have as much of that going on these days. I think, you know, there has been a shift in terms of like, can you actually justify why you're doing things that you're doing? And I think that's fair enough. However, that comes down to improving things. And I think it's not just about teacher voice, because I do think we need to have more teacher voices out there, but I also think we need to think about flexibility within the system. Where is that flexibility? Because it's either you're in or you're out. Do you know what I mean? Like, is there flexibility within the system? And probably multi-academy trusts have a little bit more of this than your ordinary average school. But like, why can't people kind of go in and out of this situation? You know, because I think it would make sense if, you know, you've got expertise, you go out there and you share it, but actually you'd want to come back in, and, you know, surely you'd want to come back in for a bit and sort of develop yourself again and see what it's like. Okay, what's going on here? What are the challenges? What are the, you know what I mean? And I agree, like, if you don't spend significant enough time in a particular school, you don't see it. Like, you know, for example, it'd be quite easy for somebody who's been a consultant for 5 years and just gone from school to school to school. They might have some more overviews because they've been to so many schools, so they have seen different environments, but they may not be able to always pick up on the things that are really significant. For example, the speech and language issues that are going on at the moment, you know, like the COVID babies have come in now. And actually the other thing is, if you're not there enough times, you don't necessarily see things, because like, for example, you know, like one of the things that really hit me was like, wow, you know, like actually some of these children, that they've been parented in a particular way during COVID, and actually their parents aren't going to change for the next child or the next child. Do you see what I mean? Right, actually we're not, this is not a short-term thing. Actually we're going to have to think more long-term than this. And it only hit me because I've been in this particular school for you know, it's like basically it's my base school, so I go there more often and I know the children better. But those things aren't going to hit you just because you go into a school one day. Do you know what I mean? Or like on the odd occasion, because you wouldn't spend enough time there. So I do appreciate that, and I do think we need to find ways of making sure that people not just keep in touch, but have that kind of have this sort of sense of actually being attached to the school still, and not just attached. And I'd say even multi-academy trusts, they're not just attached to the multi-academy trust, they are actually attached to like particular schools, or they spend enough time there so they actually do get a feel for it. And I'm not saying that it's perfect and it's a perfect solution, because everybody's got to do what they've got to do. And let's be realistic, some schools need more support than others, and given the number of schools that you've got to shift resources, and that's one of the things that you can do. But having said that, you know, it's about thinking this through. But ultimately, what, you know, like the opposite of that is, well, you just want people in the classroom. Okay, you've got people in the classroom, but then you've lost that discussion, you've lost that overview. So then what happens, you know?
I just feel as though, well, go on, Ray, because you were going to speak before.
Yeah.
I think you're all being very sensible and respectful, because you're sensible and respectful people. But I feel like that's not necessarily what's going on out in the wild world. People have money to make and things to sell, and they will jump from school to school to school, and they don't care, because that's the career they've decided, that's what they've chosen for themselves, because they couldn't hack it in one school, or they didn't like this, or they couldn't cope in the classroom. And I don't say that, I know I'm saying it in a derogatory way, and I am, but I also understand it, because classroom teaching is completely exhausting. And if someone handed me a different career on a silver platter, I would be snapping that up. So I get it, but just because you can't hack it in a classroom doesn't mean you get to then hop between classrooms and between schools selling your snake oil and not really giving a toss what happens to these kids or these teachers once you leave. So yes, in an ideal world, people would stay in their lane and keep their recommendations within their line of expertise. They would engage with the staff in that school. They'd spend some time there, get to know the staff and the kids, and then still acknowledge that that does not equate to working there every single day for an entire academic year. They would be respectful, they would be sensible, they would be logical, but you know, everyone's got bills to pay, and that's just not the reality of what's happening, unfortunately.
I think when it comes to, I think some of the source of this problem, when you teach, I remember once driving to school and seeing an air ambulance land and thinking, gosh, I wonder what happened there. You know, I'll look it up later when I get break or whatever. And drove home that evening and thought, oh my God, that happened, because you get sucked in to the world of school, and anything else that's happened anywhere else just vanishes. And so there's no time for reflection. There's no time to think, oh, when Mr. So-and-so came from this company and told us all about so-and-so, he recommended, that's a huge problem. So, and when you've got so many different ideas coming at you, because it's not just the people as well who are coming into the schools, it's the people who don't work in schools who are sending stuff out as well and giving information, writing their books and things. And there is just too much. That's always how I felt, that we were just overwhelmed with all the different ideas, almost to the point where you felt as though, or not necessarily me, but because I was an HLTA, I wasn't a teacher. I took the difficult kids out of the classes and took smaller groups. But you know, for the colleagues that I had, they were losing their opportunity to make their own solutions, because there was always somebody who would come in and tell you, or who could come in. And I think that we're looking at a clash at the moment between individuality within schools, within the teachers themselves. You know, there are some schools who want every teacher to teach every lesson the same way, regardless what lesson it is. You know, we're going to have the 10 questions at the beginning, and you're going to have 15 minutes of this. And so there's always a battle between a sort of a homogeny, that every child should have the same experience in every classroom, in every school, and then the idea that it doesn't work, does it? It doesn't work, because we're humans, and because every class is different, and you can have 2 year 11 top set classes and have to teach them completely differently. So you know, there is no homogeny, and I think there's a constant battle between what people expect a school to be able to do and have that sort of universal style, and then what actually is possible, and then that creates a resentment. And I could sense that a bit from the article. Do you see what I mean? We're the ones at the coalface. We're the people who are putting in that graft day after day, and you flit in and you tell us it will all be wonderful if you did this thing that I've dreamt up that will work, and then off you go again to the next school, and you leave us with it, and there's no time to implement it, because we're back in tomorrow morning and we've got, you know, 9H and they're really hard work, or do you get what I mean? And so you're just back in again. That's why I think I think we're in a real problem. Everything in life, every single thing on earth, Starbucks or whatever, is completely, I wasn't saying it was necessarily just a coffee chain, but everything is so complicated. You can't just be anymore. I mean, I was saying to my husband yesterday, I long for the idea that, you know, we could go back to the primary schooling of the 70s, where you did show and tell and nice things like that. But our curriculums are so packed now with things we have to do in order to get the kids to this stage, and it's working, and so it's a good thing. But our individualities and those personalities are being sacrificed for that, I think.
Agreed.
Right. Okay, I think what we're going to do is we're just going to take a short break before we discuss the next story. So I just want to say a big thank you to John Catt Educational. They're publishers of professional development books and resources. They support that intend to support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Please do look into that and level up your professional development, and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles. Also, if you're looking for, and there's amazing educational podcasts out there, there's a particular podcast that we'd like to talk about, which is Chalk and Talk with Anna Stokey. She's a passionate advocate for evidence-based maths education for students of all ages. And on her podcast, she talks about everything from effective teaching methods and how-to guides for teaching maths facts to tips for evaluating research show claims. She brings on top-notch guests, educators, researchers, and policymakers, and discusses issues that directly impact teachers and students.
So our next topic, guys, this one, again, quite an interesting one. So the title is Pupils Lose Court Fight Over Unpleasant and Distressing Isolation Policy. So I believe that a school in Leeds, I think it was taken, well, there was a judicial review lodged with the High Court. And essentially it centered around 3 pupils who had spent a significant amount of time in isolation, where basically they were being removed from lessons. I don't think it said for what behaviour. However, there was like a summary in the article about many of the reasons why children in the school had been sent to isolation. But essentially, it was like these booths where the pupils would go, and because they missed a significant amount of lesson time, not necessarily school, but lesson time, because of the fact that they were in isolation. I think they had some sort of maybe legal advocates who took this to the High Court in Leeds, and the court actually sided with the school and said that, to quote them, the school had not crossed the boundaries of what the law or good practice permits, is what the judge said. And I think the judge even mentioned that she wasn't, I mean, this isn't like a direct quote or anything, but I think she wasn't particularly happy that something like this had been brought to the court, and felt like schools should be able to have sanctions to deal with whatever behaviour is presenting in their schools. So what are your thoughts?
To be fair, I think that I actually do commend the judge on saying that actually this should not be going on. Okay, as in there should not be judicial reviews for this. Because what you're basically saying is that, you know, like whatever you think about sanction, whatever you think about the particular method, whatever, actually this is not an area for judicial review, because the impact of this is just too big, and actually it comes down to policy. So what is, you know, we've got to discuss that, and it's got to be at a national level. It can't just be at a school level either. You know, what do we actually consider to be acceptable? It can't just be hijacked by particular groups either. It's got to be a discussion, you know, it's got to be a wider discussion amongst teachers, leaders, schools, MATs, local authorities. Do you see what I mean? Like everybody involved to go, actually, what do we consider? And society and broadly as well, what do we consider reasonable and what do we consider unreasonable? Because what we can't do is end up in a situation where basically that certain parents can just get their own way, even though the detrimental impact of that across the board would be huge. So I think quite rightly she said that. We don't know the context of the pupils and why they were sanctioned, and I think that's fair enough, because I think there's a limit to that. But clearly the context was given to the judge as part of the judicial review. So well within their rights to say actually it was acceptable in that particular situation. And while we can all say there were other ways of dealing with it, we don't know, like I said, we don't know the context, we don't know the phase of the school either, because quite often certain schools, when they're going through a school improvement phase, early on sometimes there are more sanctions given, you know, like to particular pupils, and sometimes it does take time to turn a school around and to turn children around. And I think sometimes we just don't accept that is part of it, because they've gotten used to that environment, and actually the kickback there is, oh, this is what I'm used to, I want it to go back to that, even though the environment may have been very chaotic, it may not have been appropriate for learning. Do you see what I mean? There's all sorts of things going on here. So actually we need to stop and think about what was actually happening for that to happen. But I think the judge has done the right thing and actually thrown it back to you know, given the context that they were given, said, well, actually, I don't think the school's done anything wrong. Because if you're going to give it to a judge, they're going to make a judgment, right? And if we don't like it, fair enough. But you've taken it that far, so you're going to have to accept it either way. You can't just sit there and go, well, it should have been my way, because everybody thinks that. But secondly, that policy making. Yeah, but it's true, isn't it? You know, no matter which way you'd have said, like, I don't agree with the judge, right? Like, if it doesn't go your way,
So, you took it to a judge, deal with it,
Yeah, exactly. You chose to do this. So quite frankly, I don't have much sympathy for the people who took it now and they're going, well, I think it's unfair. Well, tough, you know, like you chose to make it a judicial review, then you're going to have to take what they've actually said. But I think it's right for the judge to go, actually, this should not be part of judicial reviews. This should not be a normal part of how you discuss and dispute behaviour policies in either in a particular school or across the board, because actually it needs to be a much wider discussion. It needs to be a policy decision.
Yeah, and I fully support that. I think it would be opening an enormous can of worms for them to be getting involved in this, because, I mean, how much time do silly things like that waste already anyway. But also, I feel like I need to take my own advice, kind of off the back of what you said, Tajinder. I don't work in that school. I'm not there every day. I don't know what's going on. I don't know the details. I don't know what it's like. I have no idea what happened. I don't have the full story. So I'm really hesitant to make judgments on that specific case because I don't know it. But I will say just my immediate reaction on reading that article was any child who is spending that much time in an isolation booth, clearly the isolation booth is having no effect whatsoever.
Yeah.
And other things I'm assuming are being looked at. Does that mean other things were in process? Does that mean the school was dropping the ball? I don't know because I'm not there. But I feel like it very, very, very likely comes back to schools don't have the capacity, they don't have the resources, they don't have the support to deal with all of the challenge behavior and all of the special needs that are presenting, and there are not enough alternative placements in any other different type of school for the kids who need them, and mainstream schools are not coping, because that I have seen. I have seen myself, and I wonder if this is another example of that.
Yeah, I just think that, you know, I mean, Paul has just put in the chat about the day that it's, you know, that detention is deemed unlawful is the day detentions and isolations and maybe any other sanctions are stopped. There is very little left to schools to be able to employ in the face of disruptive behavior and worse. And I think that's a huge problem. If I was the parent of a child who was spending that much time in isolation, then I wouldn't be going to court and saying the school is wrong to do this. I would be saying, what have we done wrong as parents to send a child into school every day who's like that? And I'm not saying those parents haven't, like we say, we don't know anything about it, but I might be looking at saying, if it happens again, you're off to a different school. We can't do this anymore. It's not working. You'll have to leave your friends. You'll have to go somewhere else, and you'll have to try something new, because you're obviously causing a problem. This will have come, remember, probably with lots of consultations with the parents as well, talking about this. I would imagine that the parents have been in to, you know, say, you know, really sorry, I don't know what to do with him or her, or to say, you know, never done anything wrong, don't know what you're complaining about. And these are the issues. You know, we've all had it, haven't we, where you send a student out of a class, and then the senior leadership comes. Now, that child had picked up a chair and threatened to throw it across the classroom. And then when the you know, SLT come in, they say, okay, so miss, what do you want us to do? What happened here? And you say, well, I picked up a chair. No, I never. I didn't. I was just moving it because it wasn't at the right height. I just wanted to turn it around a bit so I could, you know, and they manipulate things. And unfortunately, we see that, and we know full well what actually will have happened. But for parents, they may believe that their child really did nothing wrong. And so I think there's a huge problem with that, who is believed, the student or the parent or the teacher, and so that leads to a no movement in the behavior, because if those sanctions aren't being backed up at home, then their behavior continues, I imagine. So we can't have judges. We can't. Judges are in everything. The judicial system is everywhere, and we need to be pulling it back from things. So I agree with you, Tajinder, that it was a great thing that the judge said, I don't know why this is coming to us, and I think it's important that it stays in that situation. But really, this should be a cry for help to whoever, that schools are not managing behaviour.
Yeah, you know, Lucy, I agree with what you're saying, but it's, you know, and I completely agree generally with your point about parents. But what I found interesting about this article was when I read it, I actually got the vibe that this child or these children potentially actually have supportive parents, because I was, as in supportive of the school, because I was quite surprised to see that a child, one of them, had spent about half the school year in isolation or suspended. And to me, like, if that, because I know a lot of the time, there are a lot of parents when, as soon as they hear their child is going to be in an internal exclusion the next day because of X, Y, Z, and it's like deserved, they often pull them out of school. They refuse to send them in. It then like drags out for like a week, because they're like, each day they're not coming in, it's just, you know, rolling over into the next day. And like, they just think if they're not in that week, then they could stroll in on Monday and everyone's going to have forgotten about it. And obviously nobody has. If anything, they've just kind of made themselves like hyper visible, if anything. So I got the vibe that, like, the same way that schools are like really overwhelmed and not managing behavior, and obviously I know the responsibility on the school is not the same as the responsibility on the parent. And I also don't even know why I'm talking about this, because I'm not a parent myself, so like I'm not even speaking from experience. But like I just feel like there are also many parents that I've met anyway who are also overwhelmed and struggling with the behavior of their children and want to actually cooperate with the with the school. And sometimes I find those cases extremely sad. But to go back to Ray's point, I think another thing that really stood out to me is, if you've got a child who's spending half the year in isolation, like I think it's time to accept that this isn't working. And, I think the school does have a duty of care to consider alternative options. And yes, it could be the case, like exactly as Ray said, like we don't know enough about this. And it could be the case that there was no other specialist provision available. I think it said 2 of the pupils had, I think the legal team tried to argue that all 3 children had special educational needs, but the school disputed one of them. But by the looks of things, agreed that at least 2 of them out of 3 did. And it just, for me, begs the question of, look, I know when it comes to the actual school itself, I wouldn't doubt for a second that a school has like exhausted every avenue to try support a child, to test them, to find out what's going on, refer them to the right services. I know every school does a great job of that, but the question that I have is, when that's not working, surely there should be a point where that kind of stops and you move on to other things, whether that's referring the child to another specialist service, whether that's because, yes, the school is responsible, but ultimately it's the local authority that has a responsibility over that child's education. So why have they, like, for me, that child should be either going to a specialist provision or should have other kind of opportunities, because that would wear anyone down after a long time. And I know, like, I'm not excusing the behavior, but for me, like, that's crazy to spend half your year in isolation. That's not working.
Yeah.
Like, what else? I just think that there are so many children who just kind of fall through these gaps. I can see you touching this. Like,
yeah, no, I'm about to get into this, right? I'm sorry, but I think you're being too soft, Yasmin. I think you are, actually. If you look at some of the behaviours that were actually being displayed, it's like you've twisted it around. No, but they have. So she's the one who's absconding from classrooms, physically assaulting other pupils, shouting and screaming at them, including teachers as well, as far as I know, right? Oh, but it makes her feel stressed, and then she gets angry. Okay, I'm sorry, but you don't end up in that situation, particularly as a teenager, unless that's also been going on in primary school. That just doesn't happen.
I'm not disputing the behaviour.
You don't just suddenly end up in that situation. Too many parents, I agree, like, let it go in primary. Some of them actually think it's cute when they're like toddlers, like literally, like these children behaving this, like developing this behaviour as very young children. Some of them genuinely, like, there are times when I look at some kids and just go, you have not got over your terrible twos. Like, literally, you're still in your terrible twos, right? And it's a developmental stage where actually you've just got to say, like, it comes earlier than that. And I do think that it should come earlier than that. We shouldn't end up in a situation in a secondary school. And I agree, actually, with everybody that we shouldn't end up in a situation in a secondary school where a child is spending that much time in isolation or suspended. Right? I agree, right? But at the same time, what has happened up to that point, and it certainly shouldn't end up in judicial review, because actually this is a combination of things, right? And I also agree, it may very well be that the parents needed more support, all the rest of it. And so therefore we need to think much wider. And I'm not just like blaming the parents per se, but we need to have a better system here, because we know this goes on. We know there are parents who need support, or parents who don't necessarily parent as effectively as they could do. We know that children already, when they're very young, are developing some of these behaviours and attitudes and issues. And sometimes in a primary setting, it's easier to contain those children because it's a smaller setting, and sometimes they can provide certain support. And as soon as they go into secondary schools, and we can pretty much name them. If you went to most primary school teachers, like particularly in a tough school, and say who's not going to cope in secondary, they could name it to you. Do you know what I mean? Like, genuinely, they can say it to you. So why isn't there more going on? And it's no good just pushing it back onto schools, which is what tends to happen both from government and local authorities and these kind of pressure groups. It's just like, just keep pushing it onto the school because somehow they've got limitless resources. Actually, no, if we're going to actually say we're trying to improve things for these children, and we should be, I agree we should be, then we need to think much wider than this. And I'll go back to like the No More Exclusions campaign, for example. They've only got one aim, which is just to end exclusions. They don't care about the rest of it. And that's what bothers me about it more than anything else. It's just like, no, it's the school's fault because they exclude in the first place. And it's like the inverse, because they exclude, then it causes these problems. Well, no, these problems already exist. You know, you don't just end up with a really angry child out of the blue. Things have built up to that point. Do you know what I mean? Particularly if, you know, most of the time that child has already have these behaviors and bubbling up, and now all of a sudden they're older, they're bigger, they can be more aggressive, you know, like, of course it does, you know, like you can see that yourself. So actually what is happening beforehand, and we need more support earlier on, and I mean even before they start school, we need more support. And that doesn't mean interfering in parents, but actually, so, you know, we do have to have this balance, because I do get where people go, well, the nanny states it's, you know, it's interfering with people's parenting styles. I do understand that, but actually we need to think more carefully what is happening, because we can't just keep pushing this onto organizations and expecting them to then reverse engineer a situation when actually we could be in there in a more respectful way. For example, you know, like my niece is only like 2 and she goes for regular checkups. Actually, why is it not already feeding through this way? Do you see what I mean? It's like, actually, if she's having to go for and I'm actually going with my sister-in-law to like go to the next one because like my brother can't make it, so fine, like we're going to go. So why is it that person isn't already picking up on these things and starting to make suggestions and starting to signpost? Do you see what I mean? Like, I don't understand it. It seems to me that we don't have a LinkedIn system, and people don't understand that we've all got different roles at different times, right? The parents' role is there throughout, but actually we've all got our roles at different times, and it's not about judging people and trying to force them into a particular way. But when we can see that the child is distressed or angry or can't regulate their emotions, yeah, fair enough, like a 2-year-old's going to struggle, but there's still things that you can do to support even then. So why aren't we linking it up better?
Look, Tarjinder, there's so much of what you said that I agree with. You know, and look, I've said a million times, I'm not against exclusions. And the reason I'm not against them is because they, you know, they're necessary for the integrity of a school being able to manage their behavior policies. But like, we've agreed on the same point here, which is it's crazy to be in isolation for half a school year like that. You know, you agree. And that's essentially what I said. And so for me, like, yes, you know, parents have a responsibility, and yes, children misbehave, and yes, schools are justified in sanctioning that in whichever way they see fit. And that's why I'm also happy that this judge hasn't set a bad precedent for schools. But I also feel like, irrespective of pupils' behavior, it doesn't change the duty of care that schools have for children. And that's not me saying that they're neglecting it. It's just saying, when you can see that daily isolation isn't working, other things do need to be considered. And to me, that isn't blaming the school. Do you know what I mean? Like, that isn't like that child has lost out on so much of their education. They're like present but absent.
I hear you, but then when you think about the impact they were having on other pupils, you know, like if you think about, like, you know, sometimes what we do is we talk about the distress or the anger of that particular pupil. And I'm not saying that we should dismiss that. Sorry, I don't mean to say it in that kind of way, but actually we've got to think about everybody else as well, because the impact that it can have on a school is that, yeah, you can try and contain that child, but what's happening to all the other children? You know, how many people in the end, and I've been in a school where, you know, a really like well-behaved child, parent in the end just went, to heck with this, I'm just going to take my child out. I'm just going to take them to a different school. You know, it does have that kind of like pressure and impact. Actually, like, don't send your child to that school. So then you end up in a situation where you don't end up with a mixed group of children. You don't end up with this with an environment whereby, do you see what I mean? It just spirals. Like, exactly, it spirals. And so we've got to think about the impact on the school and the other pupils and yes, what's happening in general. And actually, that child's not going to be any better in a classroom full of other children who were disruptive, and yet you end up with that.
Tarjinder, I totally agree. And one thing in the article that actually annoyed me was the part where it said, you know, this pupil going to these isolation booths stresses them out. And so the child's response to that is to basically be more stressed in lessons and therefore accumulate more like sanctions. And then they're back in isolation. But exactly as you said, it's almost like the other way around. Like, I don't disagree that a child having spent that much time in isolation, that will definitely have a negative impact on them. But also, I just think that a lot of people don't understand the isolation isn't the starting point. It's the end. Your behavior, and no one, like when you're teaching, you don't say, right, you've talked out of turn, off to isolation. Do you know what I mean? Like you go through like an actual behavior system where isolation is often right at the end. So I agree with you like on so many points, but I just think for me, I definitely wish there were other things, even if it isn't necessarily the school being able to do it. I don't think it's wrong for a school to be able to say, we can't cater to these needs. We need to, we need to signpost this child elsewhere. I don't have an issue with that. If anything, I think it should be said more.
Do
I'm
any
sorry
of you
about the background
remember?
noise, guys.
No, that's okay. Do any of you remember there was, when we had all the Educating Essex and Yorkshire and things like that? I don't know if it was on one of those or a separate programme, but they focused on a school that had a separate unit within the school. So it was on the other side of the school, and students who were unable to behave in the school went to this other unit, and they did lessons, and they did it in a mixed group. So it was no longer, they just did the maths, the English and various things, and almost trained them on how to behave in the classroom. And all of the kids always, they just wanted to go back to the school, and they weren't allowed to go back into the main school for, this could be weeks and months, until they really learn how to listen, how to focus, how to engage in a lesson, I suppose. And once they reached that stage, I don't remember exactly, but I'm pretty sure it had a really high success rate. Very few kids were sent back out of that, and I've wondered why, when it seemed such a good system, why I've never seen it expand. I've never heard of it since. I've never heard of it as a strategy that's being rolled out elsewhere, because it worked. And you had all these kids, if you were in year 11 and you had to go there, and most of the kids were in years 8 and 9, you felt you weren't with your kin. Do you get what I mean? Because these were kids, and so you wanted to work and get out.
Just to say, that's actually that's the next point essentially I was going to make, but that's actually, I think, one of the fastest growing areas of education now. I definitely can't speak for like the rest of the country, and I certainly can't speak for primary school, but at least in London, it's named as internal alternative provision. So it's like a lot of schools now, especially like in academy trusts, are now opening these internal alternative provisions, where when you've got a child that's spiraling, they're flying through all the sanctions, they're repeatedly ending up in internal exclusion. A lot of schools now open what's called an internal AP, and some pupils can actually get referred there. And different schools have different systems. Some take referrals directly from teachers if the same name is cropping up. Some are taken from the head of year, and some, I guess, are just senior leadership meetings based on behavior points, etc. And generally speaking, I've worked in schools that have internal alternative provision. Personally, it's my favorite part of like a mainstream school to work in. I know people that run some of them in the mainstream, and I think in many ways they are extremely successful, because the pupils get to stay in their school and essentially retain their identity. They're still coming in the same uniform, they're still seeing the same teachers, they're still invited to a lot of similar things, say whether that's the prom or certain trips and things. I don't know, like they're still very much part of the school environment. However, they're in much smaller classes. They've got like one-to-one support. They've got staggered school times, so they're on like a different lunch timetable, so they don't really see the rest of the school, even though they're going to the same canteen. And they often start later and finish earlier, or sometimes later than other students.
I mean, sorry, where you go.
And I was just going to say, we've got a similar setup at my school as well. And I've seen it at a few different ones, and they can be really, really effective. When they're not particularly effective sometimes students just can't even function in that environment, because mainstream in any capacity is just not for them, but it can work really well. Another drawback is when they make a lot of progress and then they come back out and they come back out into mainstream. But there are so many extremely difficult, challenging students that they're all friends with that are not challenging enough to get a space in that internal AP, but are in mainstream. And so these kids make all this progress and do wonderful things with the staff in there and come out and they have a good 2 days, and then they just spend time with all their friends again and just right back down. So in some environments where you have kind of an extreme differential in behavior, it works really well. But if you've got these kids that are just going to hook up with their friends that are like almost as poorly behaved as they were, then it's probably not going to work long term, because it's just going to be a roller coaster forever.
Yeah, I think it only works when it's run really well. But like, I just wanted to make a point to say that they are actually increasing. And I think for some of the some of the pupils most in need, it is actually quite a nice alternative to straight up permanent exclusion. And that's not to say sometimes it doesn't work. Exactly as Ray said, there are loads of children it still doesn't work for. But for me, like, I just feel like when a school, if they can afford to have an internal alternative provision, because again, I know a lot of schools can't, or they can't staff it, etc. But I just think it can be really successful, and it is a really nice way to sometimes support pupils to get back on track and then reintegrate them into mainstream without having to go through a permanent exclusion.
Yeah, I saw an example of something which was for year 7 pupils, where, you know, like the pupils who were going to struggle both in terms of like academically but also behaviourally, who were being put in a more sort of like not a primary setting per se, but just more of that kind of environment where they're in a class for most of the day. Like, so this is just an initial thing. The idea is to bring them into mainstream, and so they still go to some of the mainstream classes for various subjects, but actually they spend a majority of their day with a single teacher, and so have that kind of base, do you know what I mean, to support them to develop the behaviours, to develop their learning habits, all of those kind of things. And that seemed to be working really well. So I do think I do think there is good practice out there that can be shared, that can be looked at, that, you know, we probably do need to do more research on it. And actually, you know, because I do think, you know, like, just like with consultants, actually, we shouldn't just go, well, it worked in that school, therefore it's automatically going to work elsewhere. But there are people coming out with novel solutions. And I think it is important that, you know, we do look at those things, because I think, you know, for myself, I thought, well, initially, if I hadn't actually gone and seen it, I probably would have thought, well, isn't it infantilizing secondary kids? But actually, now that I've seen it, I'm like, well, no, that's not what the issue is, because they can see the long term. I think sometimes with solutions for certain children, it's too short term, and I think we need to start thinking about that as well. It's like, what is our long-term goal? How can we get there? Because too often we're too reactive and not proactive enough with certain children, and going, actually, these are certain paths that we need to go down, and starting to put them down. And I think that's not, and I can understand why that is, but I think ourselves, we need to sort of think, well, are we just going down a purely reactive route? And that's true for teachers as well, you know, because there are things that you can do that are proactive, and there are times when you're just being reactive. So I do get it when people go, well, are you just going, you know, and just sending the child out? You know, I can see sometimes why there are people sort of more senior who think, well, like you haven't tried hard enough, but they haven't looked in the class to see what you have been putting in place, and actually certain things don't work. And it's about sort of adjusting it. But the other thing is, for all that it's maligned, the wider school culture does make a difference. And so somewhere like Michaela, whatever you think about it, it does have a sense of belonging. It does create that wider school culture. So, you know, had somebody like left, they would be able to fit back in a lot easier compared to elsewhere. And you're right, Ray, you know, actually, what are you going back into? Because if you're going back into chaos, and there's no point in having this nice alternative provision and then just going back into a wider school culture where there's no belonging, and there's no, you know, there's no belonging, and there's no sense of, like, you know, the school itself being organized and run well.
Yeah. I think that, I mean, it's interesting because obviously, again, you know, we have fewer schools per square 100 miles than you know, cities and places like that, and so maybe it's not reached us yet. Do you see what I mean? In Somerset, that kind of idea. Yeah. But I just felt, when I watched it, I felt that looks like the thing to do, because being internally excluded is not, there's no purposeful work. You know, as teachers, they're asked to, you know, you get a list in the morning, these students are internally excluded. If you teach any of them, please send work, and it's work on top of the work you've already got to do. And sometimes you don't find out because it's been moved in the day. Then, you know, start of period 3, suddenly you're told, can you provide some work for Bobby or whatever, and you've got to scrape something together. Yeah, exactly. And so there's nothing, there is no learning in isolation. And I think that's the thing, if you had a solution that still offered a learning option for those students but kept them out of the class, so the other students who are able to regulate their behaviour, who are interested in the lessons and who want to learn, actually have that opportunity, because I think that's still the majority.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Yeah, that I totally agree with that as well. And I think that's a really good place to end, guys. Thank you so much. I've actually really enjoyed both of these topics, and see you guys next week.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Outstanding, world-class vision, world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.